Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we leave the familiar shores of the modern world behind. We are traveling back to a time when the edges of the map were still blurred, where the ink of the cartographer met the spray of the salt-thick air. Tonight, we enter the Golden Age of Piracy, and we sit beside a man whose name has been smoothed away by the tides of time, only to be replaced by a legend, the real Robinson Crusoe. As always, take a moment to settle. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. Adjust your pillow, close your eyes, and listen to the rhythm of your breath. Let it become like the tide, constant, slow, and deep. Let us begin. The primordial ocean. In the beginning of this era, there was only the Atlantic. Before the black flags were stitched, before the wood of 1,000 ships was hewn from the forests of Europe, there was the great void of the water. To the men of the late 17th century, the ocean was not a path to be traveled. It was an entity to be feared. It was a yawning blue nothingness, older than the kings who sought to conquer it, deeper than the prayers of the sailors who crossed it. Chaos, in this world, was not a lack of order. It was the sea itself. It was the unpredictable surge of the gale, the sudden silence of the doldrums, and the crushing weight of the dark water beneath the keel. The sea was the Gaia of this story, vast, unshakable, and fertile, with both life and death. It did not care for the flags of nations or the ambitions of men. It simply was. Across this liquid abyss, the first stirrings of a new age began. The great powers England, Spain, and France were like the early Titans, reaching out to claim the world. They drew lines across the waves, naming currents and claiming islands as if the earth belonged to them. But the sea is a jealous mother. She swallows the proud and the humble alike. And in the year 1704, she was preparing a place for one man in particular, an island, small and green, sitting in the vast Pacific like a single teardrop on a blue face, the son of the coast. Before he was a castaway, before he was a ghost of the Pacific, he was Alexander Selkirk. He was born in 1676 in the small fishing village of Lower Largo, on the rugged, wind-whipped coast of Scotland. To understand Selkirk, you must understand the place that made him. Lower Largo was a place of grey stone and cold spray, where the North Sea hammered against the shore with a persistence that mirrored the spirit of its people. His father was a cobbler, a man of leather and thread, a man of the earth. But Alexander was a son of the wind. From his earliest days, the boy felt the pull of the horizon, while his brothers were content to sit in the pews of the kirk, listening to the stern warnings of the ministers. Alexander's mind was already at sea. He was a man of quarrelsome and unruly nature, not because he was evil, but because he was restless. The walls of a cottage felt like a cage. The expectations of a small town felt like a shroud. In the mythology of his own life, Selkirk was the rebel. He was the Cronus of the cobbler's shop, looking at his father's world, and finding it too small, too cramped, too devoid of the vastness he felt within his own chest. He fled the grey stones of Scotland, vanishing into the world of the sails. For years he was a ghost, learning the language of the ropes and the temper of the tides. He became a navigator, a man who could read the stars like a holy book, a man who could find a path through the trackless void. The privateers, covenant by the year 1703, the world was at war. The War of the Spanish Succession was tearing through Europe, and on the high seas, this war took a different form. It was the age of the privateer. A privateer was a strange creature of the law. They were not pirates, not yet. They carried with them a letter of marque, a piece of parchment that gave them the blessing of their queen to plunder the ships of her enemies. It was a marriage of greed and patriotism. It was a way for a common sailor to touch the gold of kings. Selkirk joined an expedition led by the famous William Dampier, a man who was as much a scientist as he was a predator. Dampier was a man of the Enlightenment, a man who charted winds and tasted exotic fruits. But he was also a man who sought the silver of the Spanish treasure ships. They set sail in 2 ships, the St. George and the Cinque Ports. Selkirk was the sailing master of the Cinque Ports, a small galley-style ship. As they left the English Channel, the world began to change. The air grew warmer, the stars shifted in the sky, and the familiar constellations of the north gave way to the strange, brilliant patterns of the south. They were leaving the known world and entering the realm of the unknown. The rot in the wood. The sea is a patient destroyer. It works its way into the smallest cracks. It rots the oak and rusts the iron. The ship, once a proud vessel of war, became a prison of wood and salt. The crew was plagued by scurvy, a sickness of the soul, as much as the body, where the gums soften and old wounds reopen, as if the body itself is forgetting how to hold together. But there was a deeper rot than the one in the timber. It was the rot of the spirit. The captain of the Cinque Ports, a young and arrogant man named Thomas Stradling, was a man of sharp words and little wisdom. He and Selkirk were like fire and flint. Every command was a spark. Every disagreement was a flame. By the time they reached the Juan Fernandez Islands, deep in the South Pacific, the Cinque Ports was leaking so badly that the men had to pump the water out day and night just to stay afloat. Selkirk, the navigator, looked at the ship and saw a coffin. He saw the way the wood groaned under the pressure of the waves. He saw the way the crew's eyes had gone hollow. He made a choice. It was a choice born of anger, of fear, and of a strange, desperate intuition. He declared that he would rather be left on the deserted islands than stay one more day on a ship that was fated to sink. He believed his brothers, the crew, would follow him. He believed they would see the truth of the rotting wood and join him in his rebellion. But when the boat hit the shore of the uninhabited island, no one followed. The great separation. Imagine the scene. The sun is beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden fingers across the volcanic sand of the beach. The Cinque Ports sits in the bay, its masts skeletal against the darkening sky. Selkirk stands on the sand. Beside him are his meager possessions: a sea chest, a musket, a pound of gunpowder, some tools, a cooking pot, and his Bible. He is shouting at the ship, his voice cracking with the strain of his pride. He is telling them they are fools. He is telling them the sea will take them. And then the silence begins. Captain Stradling gives the order. The oars of the longboat hit the water with a rhythmic, hollow sound. The boat pulls away, heading back to the ship. Selkirk stands at the water's edge, the surf licking at his boots. Suddenly, the weight of the void hits him. The pride that had propped him up for months evaporates like mist in the sun. He calls out, he begs them to come back. He wades into the water, reaching out for the retreating boat. But the law of the sea is cold. The choice had been made. The Cinque Ports weighed anchor and sailed toward the horizon, its sails turning from white to gray to a ghost-like silver in the moonlight. Alexander Selkirk was alone. Not the loneliness of a room or a quiet street, but the loneliness of an elemental world. There were no voices but the wind, no footsteps but his own, no time but the rising and setting of the sun. He was the only human heart beating on an island of 1,000 acres, surrounded by 1,000 miles of water. In that first night, as the darkness of the Pacific descended a shadow so thick it felt like the ancient Nyx herself, Selkirk lay upon the sand. He did not build a fire. He did not open his Bible. He simply lay there, listening to the breathing of the ocean, a tiny, shivering speck of life in the center of a yawning, indifferent cosmos. This was the end of the sailor, and it was the beginning of the ghost. Time on an island is not the same as time in a city. In the world of men, time is measured by the ticking of clocks, the opening of shops, and the demands of the law. But for Alexander Selkirk, now deep into his second year of isolation, time had become elemental. It was measured by the migration of the sea lions, the ripening of the wild plums, and the slow, majestic rotation of the stars. He had moved beyond the chaos of his early terror and entered a state of being that the ancient Greeks might have called ataraxia, lucidity of the soul, a stillness in the center of the storm. His body had completed its transformation. He was no longer a man of the clothes he had brought from the sink ports. Those garments had long since rotted away, victims of the salt and the constant friction of the brush. In their place, he had fashioned a needle from a sharpened nail, and, using strips of leather as thread, he had sewn himself a coat and breeches. He was a creature of fur and sinew, his skin tanned to the color of mahogany, his hair and beard a wild, salt-crusted thicket. He was becoming indistinguishable from the island itself. The intrusion of the Titans, but the world beyond the horizon was not still. The Titans of Europe, England, and Spain were still locked in their slow, grinding war for the soul of the New World. The Pacific, which the Spanish called the Spanish Lake, was a place of immense wealth and immense paranoia. To the Spanish crown, any English presence in these waters was a virus to be eradicated. One morning, while perched upon his high lookout, Selkirk saw the thing he had both craved and feared, the glint of white canvas on the horizon. His heart, which had grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of the island, hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as the ships drew closer, his joy turned to a cold, creeping dread. The ships did not fly the Union Jack. They did not bear the familiar lines of English merchantmen. These were Spanish galleons, high-pooped, heavy-bellied monsters of the sea, bristling with cannons and manned by sailors who would view a lone Englishman not as a soul to be rescued, but as a pirate to be hanged. In the mythology of the sea, the arrival of the enemy is the arrival of the storm. Selkirk knew that if he were captured, his story would end in a Spanish dungeon or at the end of a rope in Lima. The sanctuary he had built, his huts, his cats, his quiet altars of pimento wood, was now a trap. The hunt in the green, the Spanish ships dropped anchor in the bay, the very bay where Selkirk had been abandoned. He watched from the heights as the longboats were lowered. He saw the flash of steel swords and musket barrels as the soldiers stepped onto his sand. They were looking for fresh water and wood, but they were also looking for signs of intruders. They found his huts. Selkirk, hidden in the dense canopy of the fern trees, watched as the soldiers poked through his belongings. He saw them touch the skins he had cured and look at the marks he had carved into the trees. They knew someone was there. The hunt began. This was the ultimate test of the island mind. For days, Selkirk became a ghost. He did not run, he vanished. He knew every fold of the land, every hollow in the rock, every secret path through the undergrowth. He moved with the silence of the wind, watching the soldiers from mere yards away as they struggled through the thickets, cursing the heat and the terrain. At one point, the danger became intimate. A group of Spanish sailors stopped to rest directly beneath a large tree where Selkirk lay flattened against a branch, hidden by the thick moss and leaves. He could hear their breathing. He could smell the tobacco they smoked and the wine on their breath. He saw them piss against the trunk of his hiding place. He held his own breath until his lungs burned, his fingers gripping the wood with the strength of a titan. In that moment, he realized a profound truth. The island was not just his prison, it was his protector. He was not a man hiding on an island. He was the island. The Spanish were the outsiders, the clumsy intruders, who could not see the man standing right in front of them because they did not know how to truly look. Eventually, frustrated and tired, the Spanish returned to their ships and weighed anchor. As their sails faded into the blue, Selkirk descended from his heights, shaking but alive. The void had protected its own. The wisdom of the solitude after the Spanish left, a deeper silence settled over Juan Fernandez. The threat of discovery had sharpened Selkirk's appreciation for his solitude. He began to realize that the Golden Age poets spoke of was not a time of gold coins, but a state of mind. He spent more time in his chapel hut. He began to compose his own prayers, and it is said he even sang psalms to the goats and his cats. He found that the more he stripped away the needs of the world, the need for conversation, the need for status, the need for money, the more the universe opened up to him. He was experiencing a clarity that few humans ever touch. He became a master of his environment. He knew the exact moment the seasons would shift by the way the light hit a certain rock at noon. He knew which plants could heal a wound and which could settle a stomach. He had bypassed the science of the modern tongues and returned to the myth of the first men. He was Adam before the fall, but an Adam who had already known the world and rejected it. The price of the peace, yet, even in this state of grace, there was a price. The human mind is designed for the other. Without another face to look into, the sense of self begins to blur at the edges. Selkirk would sometimes find himself standing over a clear pool of water, looking at his reflection, and not recognizing the man looking back. The wild eyes, the weathered skin, was this Alexander Selkirk of Lower Largo? Or was this a new being, a child of the Pacific? He began to fear that if he stayed too long, he would lose the ability to return not just to England, but to humanity itself. He feared he would forget how to speak entirely, that his tongue would become a heavy, useless muscle in his mouth. To combat this, he spoke to the cats with increasing frequency, telling them stories of the North Sea, of the smell of fresh bread, and of the sound of the kirk bells. He was keeping the ember of his civilization alive, shielding it from the vast, damp wind of the ocean. He also began to feel the first twitches of age. His joints, once so supple, would ache after a long chase. He realized that he could not be the king of the goats forever. Eventually, the island would reclaim him. He would fall in a chasm or succumb to a fever, and the ferns would grow over his bones, and the cats would go wild, and the silence would swallow his name. He was at a crossroads. He had found peace, but he had lost his place in the story of men. He began to pray for a different kind of ship, not a Spanish predator, but a messenger from the world he had left behind. He was ready to be a man again, but he did not yet know that the man who would leave the island was not the same man who had been cast upon it. The approaching storm, as the fourth year of his isolation drew to a close, the atmosphere of the Pacific began to change. The Golden Age of Piracy was reaching its fever pitch. In the Caribbean, the pirate republic of Nassau was forming. Figures like Henry Jennings and a young Edward Teachlater, known as Blackbeard, were beginning to make their mark. The world was becoming more violent, more chaotic, and more obsessed with the very things Selkirk had forgotten. And far to the north, a new expedition was being fitted out in Bristol. 2 ships, the Duke and the Duchess, under the command of Woodes Rogers, were preparing to sail around Cape Horn and into the South Seas. They were coming for Spanish gold, but they were also coming for the ghost of Juan Fernandez. The stage was being set for the final act of Selkirk's isolation. The real Robinson Crusoe was about to meet the real world once again. But before the sails appeared, Selkirk had one final lesson to learn from the island, a lesson about the nature of time and the weight of a single human life in the face of the infinite. He sat on his lookout, the wind whipping his goatskin coat, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the blue of the sea met the blue of the sky. He was waiting, not with the frantic energy of the first year, but with the quiet, heavy patience of the mountains. He was ready. The date was February 1st, 1709, on the island of Juan Fernandez. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the Pacific in shades of bruised purple and molten gold. For 4 years and 4 months, Alexander Selkirk had watched this same sun dip into the same water. He had become a creature of the dusk, a man who lived in the quiet transition between the glare of the day and the velvet safety of the night. But on this evening, the horizon did not remain empty. 2 specks of white, no larger than the wings of a gull, appeared against the darkening blue. These were the Duke and the Duchess, 2 privateering vessels from Bristol, commanded by Captain Woodes Rogers. They were weary, their hulls encrusted with the barnacles of 2 oceans, their crews ravaged by the same scurvy and exhaustion that had once plagued Selkirk's own ship. They were searching for water, for meat, and for a place to hide from the Spanish. They did not know they were sailing into a legend. The signal fire Selkirk did not hesitate. The hesitation of the previous years, the fear of the Spanish, the doubt of his own soul, had been replaced by a singular, primal urge to be seen. He gathered the pimento wood he had stored, the wood that burned with a bright, aromatic flame. He climbed to a high point near the shore and struck his flint. On board the Duke, the sailors saw it, a light on a supposedly uninhabited island. In the Golden Age of Piracy, a light in the dark was rarely a welcome sight. It meant an ambush. It meant a Spanish garrison. It meant the hidden eyes of the enemy. Captain Rogers ordered the ships to stand off and clear for action. They spent a tense night at their cannons, watching the flickering orange glow on the hillside, wondering what manner of Titan or ghost held the torch. For Selkirk, that night was the bridge between 2 worlds. He sat by his fire, the smoke curling around his goatskin hood. He was suspended in the yawning void one last time. Behind him lay the silence of the island, a peace he had bought with years of his life. Ahead lay the noise, the greed, and the complicated laws of the world of men. He was like the Titan Prometheus, holding a fire that would either bring him back to life or consume the sanctuary he had built. The return of the longboat at dawn, the Duke sent a yawl toward the shore. As the boat crunched onto the sand, the sailors, hardened men who had seen the horrors of the Cape and the violence of the Caribbean, froze in their tracks. Emerging from the dense green of the fern trees, was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of the oldest myths of the world. He was clothed in the skins of beasts, stitched together with rough leather cords. His feet were bare and as hard as horn. His beard was a chaotic silver-brown thicket, and his eyes, the eyes of a man who had looked at the sun and the stars for 4 years without the interruption of a human face, were terrifyingly bright. Selkirk tried to speak. This was the moment he had feared in his huts. His tongue, so long accustomed to the soft purring of cats and the chanting of psalms to the wind, felt like a heavy, foreign object. The English words were there, buried under layers of silence, but they came out as half-articulated sounds, a babbling that sounded to the sailors like the language of a wild animal. "I am Alexander Selkirk." He finally managed to grate out the sounds dry as the pimento bark. He offered them goats. He offered them water. He spoke of the Spanish, and the rats, and the cats. The sailors looked at him with a mixture of awe and pity. They were looking at a man who had survived the very thing every sailor feared most, the abandonment of the tribe. He was the real Robinson Crusoe, though Defoe's book would not be written for another decade. He was the man who had looked into the abyss and remained standing. The meeting with Woods, Rogers, Selkirk was taken aboard the Duke. When he stepped onto the wooden deck, the world began to spin. The ship, which he once knew as his natural home, now felt cramped, filthy, and dizzying. The smell of hundreds of unwashed men, the stench of stagnant water and rotting rope, was an assault on his heightened senses. He had lived in the perfume of pimento wood and sea salt for so long that the civilized world smelled like decay. He was brought before Captain Woods Rogers. Rogers was a man of the Enlightenment, practical, disciplined, and observant. He sat across from this wild man of the woods and saw not a madman, but a miracle of human resilience. He noted in his journal that Selkirk appeared as if he had been at the top of his vigor, noting his incredible physical strength and his serene expression. But Selkirk struggled. When offered a dram of spirits, he turned it away. His palate had become so pure that the alcohol felt like fire. When offered the ship's rations, the salted beef and hard biscuit, he could barely swallow it. His body was rejecting the benefits of civilization. Most hauntingly, he could not sleep. The ceiling of the cabin felt like it was crushing him. He missed the stars. He missed the weight of the cats on his legs. He was a prisoner of his rescue, the rebirth of the navigator. It was William Dampier, the very man who had led the ill-fated expedition that left Selkirk behind, who recognized him. Dampier was now serving as a pilot on Rogers' ship. He told the captain that Selkirk had been the best man on the ship when they had sailed together years before. This recommendation changed Selkirk's status. He was no longer a curiosity or a castaway. He was a navigator. He was given a position of authority on the Duke. Slowly, the sailor began to overwrite the hermit. He was given clothes, though he found the shoes agonizingly restrictive, as if his feet were being forced into wooden boxes. He began to teach the crew. He showed them how to hunt the goats of Juan Fernandez with their bare hands, outrunning the fastest sailors on the ship. He showed them how to use the island's plants to cure the scurvy that was killing them. In a week, the man who had been a ghost became the savior of the expedition. He had brought order to the chaos of the sick and dying crew, just as he had brought order to his own soul in the wilderness. The departure on February 12, 1709, the Duke and the Duchess prepared to sail. For the first time in over 4 years, Selkirk watched the island of Juan Fernandez from the deck of a departing ship. He watched his lookout fade into the mist. He watched the bay, where he had begged Captain Stradling to return for him. He thought of his huts, now empty, the pimento wood fires, cold, the cats perhaps wondering where their king had gone. A profound melancholy settled over him. In the mythology of his life, this was his return from the underworld. But like many who return from the land of the dead, he found that he had left a piece of his soul behind. He was wealthy in the eyes of men. He had a job, a share of future prize money, and his life, but he was poorer in the eyes of the spirit. He was leaving the Golden Age and returning to the age of iron and ink. As the island vanished into the gray spray of the Pacific, Selkirk turned his back on the west. He was heading toward the heart of the Golden Age of Piracy. He was about to become a privateer again, a hunter of Spanish gold, a participant in the very violence he had escaped. But inside him, the silence of the island remained, a secret room that he would carry for the rest of his days. The real Robinson Crusoe was no longer alone on an island. He was now alone among men. The transition from the silence of the island to the thunder of a privateering ship was not a gentle one. For Alexander Selkirk, the return to the world of men was a descent from the heights of a solitary Olympus back into the muddy, violent currents of human history. The Duke and the Duchess were not mere vessels of rescue, they were instruments of war. As they pulled away from the green peaks of Juan Fernandez, Selkirk was no longer the master of his own time. He was once again a cog in the great, grinding machinery of the Golden Age of Piracy. In the stories of old, when a hero returns from the wilderness, he often brings with him a gift or a curse. Selkirk brought both. His gift was a body and mind honed to a razor's edge. His eyes, accustomed to tracking goats across volcanic crags, could spot a sail on the horizon long before the ship's lookouts. His feet, still refusing the confinement of leather boots, gripped the shifting deck with a prehistoric certainty. But his curse was the island mind, a quiet, internal distance that made the chatter of the crew seem like the buzzing of flies. He was among them, but he was no longer of them. The hunter of the South Seas, Captain Woodes Rogers, quickly realized that his governor of the island, as he jokingly called Selkirk, was his greatest asset. The expedition was in desperate need of a success. They had crossed the great void, they had survived the storms of the Horn, and now they hungered for Spanish silver. Selkirk was appointed as a mate, and later a master of one of the prize ships they captured. The real Robinson Crusoe was now a hunter. They prowled the coast of South America, moving like shadows along the edge of the Spanish Empire. In the mythology of this age, the Spanish were the aging titans, wealthy and slow, while the English privateers were the young Olympians, lean and hungry for the throne. They attacked the town of Guayaquil in what is now Ecuador. Imagine Selkirk, who months before had been singing psalms to cats, now leading a landing party through the humid, tropical night. He moved through the jungle with a silence that terrified his own men. He did not fear the dark. The dark had been his only companion for 4 years, while other men fumbled with their muskets and whispered in fear of Spanish ambushes. Selkirk walked as if he were still on his island serene, detached and deadly. The raid was a success. They took hostages, gold, and supplies, but for Selkirk, the gold was just heavy yellow stone. On his island, a good knife or a handful of salt was worth more than all the doubloons in the Spanish treasury. He watched his fellow sailors scramble for jewelry and silk with a sense of weary confusion. He was seeing the chaos of greed, and it lacked the dignity of the chaos of the sea. The great prize, the Manila galleon, the pinnacle of any privateer's dream, was the Manila galleon. These were the great treasures of the age ships that sailed once or twice a year from the Philippines to Mexico, laden with the riches of the Orient, spices, silks, porcelain, and unimaginable amounts of silver. To capture one was to become a king in the eyes of London. In December 1709, off the coast of California, the Duke and the Duchess sighted their prey, the Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación y Desengaco. It was a mountain of wood, a floating fortress that dwarfed the English ships. The battle was a cacophony of iron and fire. The silence that Selkirk had cultivated for 4 years was shattered by the roar of broadsides and the screams of the wounded. Selkirk stood at his post, navigating his vessel through the smoke. He was the inquirer, the one who looked through the haze of battle to find the path to victory. When the Spanish finally struck their colors and surrendered, the English found themselves in possession of a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. Selkirk's share alone would be enough to ensure he never had to touch a cobbler's needle or a sailor's rope again. He had won. He had survived the island, he had survived the war, and he had won the gold of the Titans. But as he looked at the piles of silk and the chests of silver, he felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. He was a rich man, but he was a man without a home. The island was gone, and the Scotland of his youth was a ghost story. The long voyage home, the journey back to England, took the expedition across the rest of the world. They sailed through the East Indies, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up the coast of Africa. It was a circumnavigation of the globe, a journey that proved the world was a single, interconnected web of water. During these long months at sea, Selkirk began to talk more. He told his story to Woodes Rogers, who meticulously recorded it in his journals. Rogers was fascinated by how a man's character could be reformed by solitude. He saw Selkirk as a living experiment of the Enlightenment, a man who had been stripped of society and yet had not become a beast. But Selkirk's own accounts were more haunted. He spoke of the way the stars looked from his lookout. He spoke of the specific sound the pimento wood made when it caught fire. He was beginning to realize that the most important things he had learned on the island could not be translated into the language of men. How do you explain the texture of a 4-year silence? How do you describe the feeling of being the only human soul in 1,000 miles of blue? He was becoming a celebrity before he even touched English soil. Rumors of the wild man of Juan Fernandez were spreading. The Golden Age of Piracy was an age of news and broadsheets, and the public was hungry for tales of the exotic and the impossible. Selkirk was no longer a man. He was becoming a subject. The arrival in London. In October 1711, the ships finally dropped anchor in the Thames. London was a shock to Selkirk's soul. It was a city of 600,000 people, a churning, soot-stained hive of noise and stench. After the pure air of the Pacific, the smell of coal smoke and open sewers was suffocating. He walked the streets of London in his fine new clothes, his pockets full of prize money, but he felt like a ghost haunting a graveyard. People stared at him. He was the man of the hour. He was interviewed by Richard Steele, one of the most famous writers of the day, who wrote that Selkirk had a cheerful but serious look, and that one may see that he has been much separated from the world by his aspect and gesture. Steele noted something profound. Selkirk seemed to regret his rescue. "I am now worth £800, Selkirk reportedly said, but shall never be so happy as when I had not a farthing." This is the tragedy of the real Robinson Crusoe. He had returned to the Golden Age, but he had found it to be an age of iron. He was surrounded by people, yet he was more lonely than he had ever been on the island. On Juan Fernandez, his loneliness had a purpose. It was a dialogue with God and nature. In London, his loneliness was a disconnect from a society that cared only for his story, not for his soul. The shadow of Daniel Defoe. It was in these London coffeehouses that the seeds of literature were sown. Among those who heard the story or read Woodes Rogers' account was a merchant and writer named Daniel Defoe. Defoe saw in Selkirk's struggle a perfect metaphor for the human condition. But Defoe was a man of his time. He changed the story. He moved the island from the Pacific to the Caribbean. He added a companion Friedebue, because the 18th century mind could not truly grasp the idea of a man being truly alone and remaining sane. He turned Selkirk's spiritual survival into a story of colonial industry and civilizing the wild. Selkirk watched as his life was transformed into Robinson Crusoe. He saw the elemental truths of his experience, the carer, the cats, the pimento fire, turned into a handbook for the burgeoning British Empire. The world didn't want the real Selkirk, the man who missed the silence. They wanted the hero who conquered the void. As the book became a sensation, the real man began to fade. Alexander Selkirk, the son of the Scottish coast, the navigator of the Cinque Ports, the king of the goats, was being replaced by a fictional shadow. And so, he did the only thing a man of the sea could do. He began to look for a way back to the water. The return to one's origin is rarely the homecoming the heart imagines. When Alexander Selkirk finally traveled north from the clamor of London to the gray, salt-stung shores of Lower Largo, he was a man of immense fortune. In the eyes of his father, the cobbler, and the neighbors who had once whispered about his unruly nature, Alexander had achieved the impossible. He had survived the abyss and returned with the gold of the Spanish Titans. But as he walked the familiar paths of his youth, the real Robinson Crusoe found that the village had remained small, while he had grown vast and as silent as the Pacific itself. In the mythology of the hero's journey, the return is the most dangerous stage. The hero brings the wisdom of the underworld back to the world of the living, but the living often have no language to receive it. Selkirk walked through the streets of Scotland like a man made of glass. He was there, visible and solid, but the world seemed to pass right through him. He had spent 4 years and 4 months learning the secret rhythms of the earth, and now the rhythmic hammering of his father's shop and the tolling of the kirk bells felt like a cacophony of trivialities. The architect of solitude, he tried, at first, to be the son they expected. He sat in the pews of the church, his wild beard trimmed, his body encased in the fine wool of a gentleman. But the walls of the church felt closer than the cliffs of Juan Fernandez. The air in the rooms of his childhood home felt heavy, thick with the breath of others and the dust of a sedentary life. He found that he could not sleep in a bed. The softness of the mattress felt like a trap, a sinking marsh that threatened to swallow the hard-won strength of his limbs. He began to retreat, not back to the sea, not yet, but into a strange, localized version of his island life. In the garden behind his father's house, Selkirk began to dig, using the same deliberate, elemental focus he had used to build his huts in the Pacific. He fashioned a cave in the earth. It was a sanctuary of soil and stone, a place where the sounds of the village were muffled, and the light was filtered through the damp green of the Scottish coast. He would spend hours in that hole, in the ground. To the villagers, it was the behavior of a madman, a soul broken by the chaos of the void. But to Selkirk, the cave was the only place where he could breathe. In the dark, he could close his eyes and imagine the smell of pimento wood. He could hear the phantom barking of the sea lions over the distant crashing of the North Sea. He was trying to replicate the island mind in a world that demanded he be a citizen, a brother, and a son. The ghost of Lower Largo, the people of Lower Largo, began to treat him as a living myth. Children would whisper as he passed, looking for the scars of his battles or the wildness in his eyes. He was a celebrity in a town that didn't believe in celebrities, only in sinners and saints. Selkirk, however, had moved beyond those categories. On the island, he had seen that good and evil were human inventions. The sea and the wind knew only necessity and truth. He often wandered the shores of the Firth of Forth alone. He would stand for hours, staring out at the water, his lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps in conversation with the ghosts of his cats. He was looking for something that the North Sea could not provide, the specific, terrifying clarity of the absolute horizon. The Firth was crowded with fishing boats, and merchantman net was a busy human water. He hungered for the yawning void, the place where a man could see the curvature of the earth and know his own insignificance. It was during this time that the legend of his solitude began to crystallize in the public imagination. The real Robinson Crusoe was becoming a figure of tragedy. The world saw a man who had everything, money, fame, and a homeland, yet wanted nothing more than to be back on a barren rock in the middle of a trackless ocean. He was a living reminder that the Golden Age of Piracy was not just about the acquisition of gold, but about the loss of the soul's anchor, the woman, and the sea. Even in his isolation, the human heart remains a persistent hunter. During his walks, Selkirk met a young woman named Sophia Bruce. She was a dairymaid, a creature of the fields and the morning mist. In her, perhaps, Selkirk saw a reflection of the simplicity he had found on the island. She did not ask him for stories of the Manila galleon or the Spanish dungeons. She saw the man, not the myth. They fled together. In a move that shocked the village, Selkirk abandoned his cave, his family, and his respectable life to go to London with Sophia. It was a final attempt to find a middle ground, a way to live in the world of men without losing the silence. They lived in the shadows of the city, a privateer and a dairymaid, trying to build a world of two in the center of the swarm. But London was the seat of the very chaos Selkirk had learned to despise. It was a place of contracts, of debts, and of the constant wearying pressure of being a character in someone else's story. The book Robinson Crusoe had been published, and the fictional character was now more real to the public than the man himself. Selkirk was being chased by a ghost made of ink and paper. Every time he spoke, he felt the words of Daniel Defoe overlapping with his own. He was being erased by his own legend, the call of the abyss. In the end, the cave in the garden and the love of a quiet woman were not enough to settle the storm in his blood. Alexander Selkirk was a creature of the elemental world. The titans of the sea were calling him back. He realized that he could not be a husband or a neighbor in a world of fences and walls. He needed the deck beneath his feet. He needed the stars to be his only roof. In 1720, he did what he had always done when the world grew too small. He vanished. He signed on as a master's mate on a king's ship, the HMS Weymouth. He was no longer a privateer or a hunter of gold. He was a servant of the crown, heading toward the coast of Africa to hunt the very pirates who had defined his era. He was joining the hunt for men like Bartholomew Roberts, the Black Bart of legend, as the Golden Age of Piracy began its final bloody transition into the Age of Order. As the Weymouth pulled away from the English coast, Selkirk felt the weight of the land fall away. He did not look back at Sophia, nor at the cave in Scotland. He looked forward, toward the Atlantic. He was returning to the great void. He was a man who had lived 1,000 years in the space of 4, and he knew that his story would not end in a bed or a garden. It would end where it began, in the salt, in the wind, and in the silence. The final horizon, the Weymouth, was a ship of death, not because of battle, but because of the fever, the yellow jack that haunted the African coast. It was a sickness that mirrored the chaos of the early worlden scene, unstoppable and indifferent to the rank or history of its victims. On December 12, 1721, the man who had survived the absolute isolation of the Pacific finally met a force he could not outrun. Alexander Selkirk died of the fever. There was no island to catch him this time. There were no cats to watch over his sleep. He was sewn into a canvas shroud final, tight garment to replace the goatskins of his youth and cast into the water off the coast of West Africa. The sea, his Gaia, his mother, and his predator, opened her mouth and swallowed him whole. He sank into the yawning void, returning to the elemental truth from which he had come. He left behind a chest of money, a confused widow, and a story that would become one of the most famous in the history of the world. But the real Mantha, one who sat by the pimento fire and watched the stars, remained a secret, a ghost of the wood that the world would never truly know. The passing of Alexander Selkirk into the dark waters of the Atlantic did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it marked the moment his lived experience dissolved into the collective consciousness of the Golden Age of Piracy. While Selkirk had found a quiet, spiritual order within his isolation, the world he left behind was spiraling into a different kind of chaos. We must now turn our gaze away from the solitary peaks of Juan Fernandez and toward the turquoise shallows of the Caribbean, where the yawning void of the ocean was being filled by a new generation of titans, the lords of the Black Flag. In the mythology of this era, if Selkirk was the hermit of the deep, then the pirates of Nassau were the rebels of the earth. They were the men who looked at the rigid hierarchies of the British Navy and the Spanish crown and saw a tyranny as heavy as the sky pressing down upon Gaia. They sought to carve out a space where no king could reach, a pirate republic built upon the ruins of a broken empire. This was the age of the ghost ship, the age of the maroon, and the age where the line between a hero and a monster became as blurred as the horizon in a tropical storm. The cradle of chaos, Nassau, to understand the world that breathed life into the legend of the castaway. One must look at New Providence in the Bahamas. In the early 1700s, Nassau was not the vacation paradise of the modern tongue. It was a gaping wound in the side of civilization. It was a place of disorder, confusion, and frenzy, much like the chaos that preceded the Greek gods. The harbor was shallow, protected by reefs that would tear the belly out of a heavy man of war, but offered a perfect sanctuary for the light, fast sloops of the sea rovers. Here, the 100-handed ones, the common sailors who had been beaten, starved, and cheated of their wages, gathered to build something new. They were men like Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold, veterans of the privateering wars, who had found themselves discarded by their sovereigns once the treaties were signed. They were the elemental truths of the sea, men who realized that in the middle of the ocean, the only law that matters is the law of the wind and the strength of the arm. In Nassau, they created a society that was a mirror image of the world they had fled. While the kings of Europe ruled by divine right, the pirates ruled by the articles, a social contract signed by every man on the ship. They voted for their captains. They shared their plunder in equal portions. They provided for their injured. It was a radical, dangerous experiment in democracy, conducted in the shadow of the gallows. They were trying to build an Olympus of their own, but their stones were made of stolen silver, and their altars were stained with rum and blood. The maroon, the living death within this pirate culture, the story of Alexander Selkirk, resonated with a peculiar, terrifying power. The pirates did not fear death by the sword or the cannon. That was a quick transition, a sudden return to the elements. What they feared most was the maroon. To be marooned was to be cast out of the tribe and into the silence. It was the ultimate punishment, reserved for those who betrayed their brothers or broke the sacred articles. The word itself comes from the Spanish cimarron, meaning a wild animal that has escaped from domesticity. To be marooned was to be returned to the state of the beast. When a pirate was marooned, he was given exactly what Selkirk had: a small amount of powder, a musket, a bottle of water, and his own thoughts. He was left on a deserted Kia spit of sand that the tide might swallow at any moment. To the pirates, the island was not a sanctuary of peace. It was a yawning void where a man would be forced to face the ghosts of his own making. They told stories of men who had been found years later, unable to speak, their minds shattered by the same silence that Selkirk had turned into a cathedral. Selkirk's survival was whispered about in the taverns of Nassau, not as a feat of endurance, but as a feat of magic. He was the man who had tamed the maroon. He was the one who had looked into the gaping mouth of the island and had not been consumed. For the pirates, he represented the possibility that a man could exist outside of any system. Neither a servant of the king nor a member of a crew and still remain a man. The rise of the black flag. As the 1710s progressed, the atmosphere of the Caribbean grew darker. The Golden Age was entering its most violent phase. The privateers, once the legal predators of the crown, had fully transitioned into pirates. They began to fly the Jolly Roger, the black flag adorned with the skull and crossbones. This flag was more than a signal of terror. It was a memento mori, a reminder that in the yawning void of the sea, life is fleeting. The black was the color of the night, the color of the abyss. The bones were the elemental truths of the human form, stripped of the silks of the rich and the rags of the poor. By raising the black flag, the pirates were declaring themselves dead to the world. They were ghosts who had already crossed the Styx, and therefore they had nothing left to fear from the laws of men. Among these figures was Edward Teach, the man who would become Blackbeard. If Selkirk was the hermit of the island mind, Teach was the performer of the pirate mind. He understood that power in the Golden Age was built on image and myth. He braided hemp into his beard and set it on fire during battle, wreathed in smoke like a demon emerging from Tartarus. He wanted his enemies to see not a man, but a force of nature, a storm given human shape. Teach and his contemporaries were the titans who challenged the order of the world. They seized ships not just for the cargo, but for the act of defiance. They were the Cyclopes of the Atlantic, strong, simple, and fearing no god. But like the titans of Greek myth, their reign was destined to be short. The great Mother Gaia sea was beginning to turn against them, and the Sky Father, the British Admiralty, was preparing a final, crushing judgment. The ghost of the castaway in the heart of the pirate. It is said that many pirates carried copies of the accounts of Selkirk's life. In the quiet moments between the raids, when the ships lay at anchor in some hidden lagoon, the sailors would read of the man who lived with goats and cats. They found a strange comfort in his story. The pirate's life was one of constant noise, the creaking of the ship, the roaring of the wind, the shouting of the men. Selkirk's silence represented a peace they could never have. They were men who had fled the chaos of the city, only to find a different chaos on the water. Selkirk, by contrast, had found a stillness that they envied. There is a legend of a pirate who, after reading of Selkirk, intentionally sought out a deserted island and asked to be left there. He didn't want the gold, he didn't want the fame. He wanted the real Robinson Crusoe experience. He wanted to see if the silence would heal him or break him. He was never seen again. Whether he found the peace of the pimento fire or the madness of the yawning void, the sea kept the secret. The closing of the map as the 1720s dawned the same year. Selkirk returned to the sea for the final time. The golden age of piracy began to fade. The yawning void was being mapped, measured, and patrolled. The British Navy was no longer a collection of scattered ships. It was a disciplined wall of iron. The pirate Republic of Nassau was reclaimed by the Crown under Woodes Rogers, the very man who had rescued Selkirk. In a poetic twist of history, it was the man who saved the world's most famous castaway who became the one to destroy the world's most famous pirate sanctuary. Rogers brought with him the letter of wood and iron, a royal pardon for those who surrendered, and a rope for those who didn't. The elements were being tamed. The titans were being cast back into the womb of the earth. The age of the individual, of the man alone against the elements, was giving way to the age of the empire, where every soul was a number on a ledger. But the story of the man on the island remained a flickering flame in the dark, reminding the world that no matter how much of the ocean is mapped, the human soul will always find a way to get lost in getting lost, find itself. To look into the heart of Alexander Selkirk's experience is to look into a mirror where the reflection has been stripped of all ornament. In our modern world, we are defined by the other. We see ourselves in the eyes of our friends, the judgment of our enemies, and the expectations of our families. But what happens when the social mirror is shattered? What remains of a man when the modern tongues of society fall silent and there is no one left to witness his existence? This is the psychology of the islander journey into the yawning void of the self that every sailor in the golden age of piracy feared, but few truly understood. In the Greek myths you know so well, the gods often punished mortals by transforming them, turning them into trees, stones, or beasts. For Selkirk, the island of Juan Fernandez was a place of a different kind of transformation. It was not his form that changed at first, but his island mind. In the first months, he suffered from what the mariners of the 18th century called the vapors of the soul. It was a profound melancholy, a weight of grief so heavy that the very act of drawing breath felt like a labor. This was the mind's rebellion against the lack of a witness. If no one sees me, do I truly exist? If I speak and no one hears, is there a sound? The dissolution of the ego. For the first year, Selkirk was haunted by the ghost of the sailor. He was still trying to live by the rules of the world he had left behind. He kept his clothes as long as they would hold together, even when they became a hindrance. He stayed on the beach, staring at the horizon, his identity still tethered to the hope of a ship. He was a man in waiting, a man defined by his absence from society. But as the second year dawned, the ego, the Cronus of the mind that seeks to rule and control, began to starve. Without the constant feedback of human interaction, the structures of the personality began to dissolve. The anger that had made him unruly in Scotland had no object to strike against. The pride that had caused him to challenge Captain Stradling had no audience to impress. In the silence of the Pacific, Selkirk's personality was being ground down by the slow, rhythmic tides of the island, like a rough stone being turned into a smooth pebble. This is the point where many men in history have slipped into madness. In the Golden Age, stories were common of feral men found on the coasts of Africa or the islands of the Caribbean, men who hissed like cats or barked like dogs, having lost the divine spark of reason. The void is hungry, and it often fills the empty spaces of the mind with delusions and terrors. But Selkirk found a different path. Instead of falling into the abyss, he learned to walk upon its surface. He replaced the social mirror with the natural mirror, the sacred routine. How does a man stay sane when time has no meaning? Selkirk found the answer in the elemental truths of routine. He became a priest of his own life. Just as the Titans of old were bound by the laws of the cosmos, Selkirk bound himself to a strict ritual of survival. He did not eat when he was merely hungry. He ate when the sun reached a certain height. He did not pray only when he was afraid. He sang his psalms at the exact moment the first light touched the peaks of the island. This ritualization of life is a defense mechanism of the highest order. By turning mundane tasks, hunting, cleaning, cooking into sacred acts, he gave his life a geometry that the chaos of the island could not breach. He was building an internal Olympus. In his mind, he was no longer a castaway. He was the governor, the protector, and the chronicler. He began to view the goats not just as meat, but as his subjects. He viewed the cats not just as mousers, but as his companions. He was reconstructing a society of one, anchored by the only voice he had left, his Bible. The Bible was more than a religious text for Selkirk. It was a linguistic anchor. It kept the English tongue alive in his mind. The rhythmic, majestic prose of the King James Version provided a counterbeat to the roaring of the sea. It prevented his thoughts from becoming wordless and animalistic. By reading aloud to the trees and the tides, he was asserting his humanity against the formless nothingness of the wilderness. He was the logos in the center of the chaos, the peace of the predator. A strange thing happens to a man who lives as a predator for years. Selkirk's senses, once dulled by the stench of the ship and the noise of the tavern, became preternaturally sharp. It is said that by his third year he could smell a storm before the clouds appeared. He could hear the footfall of a goat a half-mile away. He was no longer thinking about survival. He was vibrating with it. Psychologically, this led to a state of constant presence. In the world of men, we live in the past or the future. We regret the morning and fear the evening. But on the island, there is only the now. The real Robinson Crusoe lived in a state of hyper-awareness that modern science might call flow, but the ancients would have called grace. He was in perfect alignment with his environment. When he ran through the woods, he did not see the branches as obstacles. He saw them as part of his own body. This led to the serenity that Woodes Rogers would later remark upon. It was the peace of a man who has no secrets, because there is no one to keep them from. It was the honesty of the elements. On the island, you cannot lie to the mountain. You cannot cheat the cold. You are exactly what you are, no more and no less. For a man who had spent his life in the quarrelsome friction of human society, this absolute honesty was a profound relief. The real Robinson Crusoe had found that the greatest luxury in the world is not gold, but the absence of the need to perform. The return of the shadow, however, the mind is never entirely at rest. Even in his state of grace, Selkirk had his underworld. He was haunted by dreams of the people he had wronged and those who had wronged him. In the silence of the night, the faces of his brothers, his father, and the crew of the Cinque-Ports would appear in the embers of his fire. This is the shadow of the island. Without the distractions of work and talk, the past becomes as vivid as the present. Selkirk had to sit with his guilt. He had to face the fact that his own pride had put him on this rock. He had to forgive the world for forgetting him, and more importantly, he had to forgive himself for being a man who was so difficult to love. When he was finally rescued, this was the part of him that the sailors couldn't understand. They saw a hero. He saw a man who had finally made peace with his own ghosts. They saw a wild man. He saw a man who had become domesticated by the divine. The tragedy of his return to England was that he was forced to put back on the mask of the personality. He had to become Alexander Selkirk again, a character with a history and a future. When he had grown used to being simply a presence in the woods, the island mind is a dangerous gift. It gives you the world, but it makes you unfit for the city. It gives you the truth, but it robs you of the comfort of the lie. As we continue tonight, remember that the Golden Age of Piracy was not just a battle for the cit, was a battle for the mind. And Selkirk, in his 52 months of silence, had won a victory that no pirate king could ever claim. He had conquered the yawning void within himself. To understand the soul of the castaway, one must understand the body of the island. Juan Fernandez was not a mere coordinate on a navigator's chart. It was a living, breathing entity, fragment of the earth that had risen from the depths of the Pacific through fire and upheaval. In the mythology of the sea, every island is a world unto itself, a miniature cosmos born from the union of the volcanic Tartarus below and the Uranus of the sky above. For Alexander Selkirk, this island, specifically the one known as Mza Tiara, was his Gaia. It was the stage upon which his 52-month drama of survival was played, and its geography became the map of his own mind. Tonight, let us walk through that landscape. Imagine the air, not the heavy soot-laden air of London, but air so pure it feels like silk against the skin. It is cooled by the Humboldt Current, that great river of cold water that flows up from the Antarctic, bringing with it the breath of the ice. The island rises abruptly from the blue void, a jagged emerald crown placed upon a head of black volcanic rock. It is a place of dramatic verticality, where the mountains, tall and wild of your Greek myths, are not metaphors, but sheer walls of fern and stone. The threshold of the shore, we begin where Selkirk began, on the beach of Cumberland Bay. To the modern ear, a beach sounds like a place of rest, but to the real Robinson Crusoe, it was a threshold of terror. The sand here is not white and soft. It is dark, composed of pulverized basalt and the bleached shells of a million forgotten creatures. This was the yawning void of his first months. Above the beach, the land rises in steep, amphitheater-like slopes, covered in dense thickets of cabbage trees and giant ferns whose fronds are as long as a man's S-arm. In the shallows of the bay, the Pontus of the Pacific surged with a will of its own. Here, the lobsters, the monstrous children of the sea, crawled in such abundance that Selkirk could reach into the water and pull them out with his bare hands. They were his first allies, their sweet, white flesh providing the sustenance that kept his spirit from flickering out in the early darkness. But the shore was also the territory of the hecatontures of this world, the sea lions. Thousands of them lined the bay, their massive, scarred bodies huddling together, their roars echoing off the cliffs like the sound of a distant war. They were the guardians of the island, and their presence kept Selkirk pinned to the higher ground, forcing him to look upward toward the peaks. The forest of pimento and sandalwood leaving the shore. We move into the interior, the heart of the green. This was Selkirk's sanctuary. The island was covered in forests of Luma apiculata, the pimento trees that gave him his fire and his light. These trees were his melior, the nymphs of the wild. When he cut their wood, the air would fill with a scent like allspice and cloves, a fragrance so intoxicating it acted as a balm to his troubled mind. The wood burned with a steady white flame, leaving behind no soot, only a clean, aromatic ash. Higher still grew the sandalwood, the shining mother of the island's treasures. The wood was so valuable in the world of men that it would eventually lead to the island's ruin. But for Selkirk, it was simply a companion. He moved through these woods with the silence of a spirit. The ground was a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves, muffling his footsteps until he could walk among the birds, the tiny fire-crown hummingbirds and the red-breasted Juan Fernandez birds, without startling them. He was no longer an intruder. He was a part of the canopy. In these forests, Selkirk built his 2 huts. He chose a spot where the wind was broken by a natural curve of the hillside. Here, the geography offered him Themis, divine order. 1 hut for the body, 1 for the soul. He lined the floors with the fragrant needles of the trees, creating a bed that smelled of the earth's own dreams. In the stillness of the forest, away from the roaring of the sea lions, he found that the island had a heartbeat. It was the sound of water-hidden springs that trickled down from the heights, cold and clear as diamonds, feeding the life that clung to the volcanic slopes, the high ridges, and the lookout to find the true Olympus of the island we must climb. Selkirk's path took him up the star-strewn ridges toward the place now known as his lookout. This is a narrow saddle of land, a precarious bridge between 2 valleys. To the east, he could see the vast, empty Pacific stretching toward South America. To the west, he could see the jagged peaks of the island's spine, often shrouded in a shadow so thick even chaos recoiled, the mists of the high altitude. The wind here is a living thing. It screams through the gaps in the rock, a Hyperion of air that never ceases. But it was here that Selkirk felt most alive. The grass on these heights was short and sweet, kept trimmed by the Titan sons of the island, the goats. These animals, descended from Spanish survivors, were the masters of the geography. They lived on the edges of the impossible, standing on ledges no wider than a handbreadth. Selkirk's mastery of the geography was proven here. He learned to run along these ridges with his eyes closed, knowing every dip and every loose stone. He became a creature of the vertical. He no longer saw the cliffs as dangers, but as stairs. He would leap across the abyss beneath the earth, the deep, fern-choked ravines, with a grace that would have shamed the finest athlete in London. The geography had reshaped his bones. It had hardened his muscles into the likeness of the basalt itself. The garden of the deep, but the island's geography did not end at the water's edge. In his moments of quiet, Selkirk would look down from the cliffs into the pure upper air of the sea. The water was so clear that he could see the forests of kelp swaying hundreds of feet below the surface. He saw the great schools of fish moving like silver clouds through the blue. He saw the shadows of sharks, the silent furies of the deep patrolling the edges of the reef. He realized that the island was not just a piece of land. It was the tip of a mountain that stretched down into the very foundations of the world. He was living on the peak of a submerged titan. This realization gave him a sense of minimicine, of the memory of all things. He felt the ancientness of the rock beneath his feet. He knew that the island had been there long before the first ship had ever sailed, and it would be there long after his own name was forgotten. The real Robinson Crusoe found his peace in the permanence of the geography. In London, things changed, fashions faded, buildings fell, and people lied. But on Juan Fernandez, the pimento would always smelled the same. The wind always blew from the southwest. The goats always climbed the same ridges. The island was a constant, an elemental truth that did not require his belief to exist. It was the ground he stood upon, both literally and spiritually. The fading of the map as you settle deeper into your sleep. Imagine yourself standing on that ridge with Selkirk. The sun is setting, casting a long golden shadow across the valley of his huts. The air is cooling, and the scent of the sea is mingling with the spicy perfume of the pimento fire. The geography is softening, the sharp edges of the cliffs blurring into the purple dusk. The island is a place of absolute clarity. There are no maps here, only the felt experience of the stone and the wind. Selkirk is no longer a man with a name. He is a part of the vast and star-strewn sky that arches over the Pacific. He is the spirit of the mountain, the ghost of the wood, and the king of the goats. The geography has swallowed him, and in doing so, it has saved him. The yawning void of the ocean is all around us now, a nourishing sea that carries the island through the darkness of the universe. Close your eyes and feel the island beneath unshakable, ancient and silent. The geography of the legend is the geography of peace, and in that peace there is only the rhythm of the waves, the scent of the wood, and the deep, restorative sleep of the castaway. In the myths of the First Age, the gods did not create with their hands alone. They used instruments of power. Hephaestus had his forge. Gaia had her sickle of flint. For Alexander Selkirk, the transition from a doomed sailor to a sovereign of the island was mediated by the small, humble collection of objects he had carried from the sink ports. These were not merely tools. They were the elemental truths of a civilization he had both rejected and craved. They were the shards of the old world that he would use to build the new. Tonight, let us look closely at these artifacts. Imagine them laid out upon the dark volcanic sand, illuminated by the fading light of the Pacific sun. A sea chest, a musket, a pound of gunpowder, a navigation scale, a cooking pot, a knife, and a Bible. To a king, this is a pittance. To a castaway, this is the entire inheritance of the human race. These were his titans, the forces he would employ to keep the chaos of the wilderness at bay. The metal and the flame, we begin with the most vital of his companions, the knife. In the Golden Age of Piracy, A man's knife was his third hand. For Selkirk, it was his Cronus, the blade that severed him from his dependency on others. It was a simple thing of iron and wood, but in his hands it became the architect of his survival. He used it to skin the goats, to carve the pimento wood for his huts, and to mark the passing of the days into the bark of the trees. When the blade grew dull, he sharpened it upon the volcanic stones of the beach, a rhythmic scraping sound that became a form of meditation. Then there was the musket. This was a heavy flintlock piece, an instrument of brontes and stirrups, the thunder and the lightning. In the early months, the crack of the musket was Selkirk's only way of asserting his dominance over the monstrous children of the island. But gunpowder is a finite spirit. It is a portion of the old world that cannot be replenished. Selkirk watched his store of powder dwindle with a growing sense of minimicine memory and loss. He realized that he could not rely on the thunder forever. He had to learn the ways of the Melier, the nymphs of the wild. He began to use his tools to create other tools. He fashioned a needle from a sharpened nail, using the internal mechanisms of his chest to provide the metal. He used the nourishing sea to provide salt for curing skins. He was a smith of necessity, transforming his meager possessions into a self-sustaining ecosystem. The tools were no longer just objects. They were extensions of his own will. The vessel of sustenance, consider the cooking pot. It was a simple iron kettle blackened by 1,000 fires. In the yawning void of the island, this pot was the center of his domestic Olympus. It was where the chaos of raw meat and wild herbs was transformed into the order of a meal. To eat from a pot, to use a spoon carved from wood, was to maintain a boundary between himself and the animals he hunted. He cooked with a deliberate, slow grace. He would stew the goat meat with the wild turnips and watercress he found in the hidden valleys. The steam rising from the pot carried the scent of the island, but the act of cooking carried the scent of home. As long as he boiled his water and seared his meat, he was still Alexander Selkirk of Lower Largo. He was refusing to let the night so thick even chaos recoiled enter his stomach. He was feeding the divine spark within him, using a piece of iron as his altar. When the pot was not in use, he kept it scoured with sand until it shone like the radiant Phoebe, the moon. This cleanliness was not a matter of hygiene alone. It was a matter of spirit. In the Golden Age, a dirty ship was a dying ship. Selkirk treated his island as his vessel. Every tool had its place. Every object was polished and respected. He was a master of his little world, and his tools were the subjects that never betrayed him. The navigational soul among his most curious possessions were his mathematical instruments, his navigation scale, and his calipers. To a man trapped on a fixed point in the ocean, a navigation scale might seem like a mockery. There was nowhere to go. There was no course to plot. But for Selkirk, these were the tools of Coys, the inquirer. He used them to measure the movements of the stars. He would sit on his lookout, the brass instruments cool in his hands, and map the star-strewn Uranus above him. By calculating his position, he was reminding himself that he was not lost. He knew exactly where he was on the face of the earth, even if the rest of the earth did not know he was there. This was a psychological victory over the nothingness. He was a dot on a map of his own making, a fixed point of reason in a sea of uncertainty. These instruments represented the Enlightenment, the Lord of Light, Hyperion. They were a reminder that the world was orderly, that the planets moved according to law, and that even his isolation was part of a grand celestial geometry. When he looked through his lens at the moon, he was connected to the astronomers in London and the navigators in the Caribbean. He was part of the great chain of being, a link that had not been broken, merely stretched. The word in the silence. Finally, we come to the most powerful tool in his chest, the Bible, as we have touched upon before. This was his logos, but let us look at it as a physical object. It was a book of paper, ink, and leather materials that are the natural enemies of the salt and the damp. Selkirk kept his Bible wrapped in a piece of goatskin, shielded from the Pontus that sought to dissolve all things. He did not just read the book, he inhabited it. In the Golden Age, the Bible was the themis of the common man, the embodiment of divine law. For Selkirk, the words on the page were a landscape more familiar than the island itself. When the silence of the Pacific became too loud, he would open the book and let the voices of the prophets and the poets fill his hut. He was using the tool of language to prevent the disorder and confusion of madness. He would read the same passages hundreds of times until the verses were etched into his mind like the marks on his trees. He was a constellation bearer, carrying the light of human thought through the long, dark night of his isolation. The Bible was his compass, his anchor, and his mirror. It told him who he was when the island tried to tell him he was nothing. The legacy of the chest. When Selkirk was eventually rescued, he left some of his tools behind, the things he had fashioned from the island itself. But he carried his sea chest, his Bible, and his instruments back to the world of men. They are relics now, preserved in museums, the silent witnesses to a struggle that redefined what it means to be human. As you drift toward sleep, imagine those tools: the cold iron of the pot, the smooth leather of the Bible, the sharp edge of the flint. They are symbols of the human ability to create order out of chaos. They remind us that even in the yawning void, we have the power to build a home. The real Robinson Crusoe was a man who understood that a tool is only as strong as the spirit that wields it. He had turned his meager possessions into a kingdom. And now, as the fire of the day burns down to embers, let those tools rest. The work is done. The order is established. The silence of the island is no longer a threat. It is a cradle. Sleep now in the sanctuary of the settled mind, where every thought has its place, and every breath is a prayer to the elemental truths of the night. As the sun of our consciousness begins to set, casting long amber shadows over the rugged terrain of our minds, let us wander deeper into the green heart of Juan Fernandez. In the ancient myths, the earth was not merely dirt and stone. It was Gaia, a living mother, who brought forth the Melior, the nymphs of the wild, to nourish and protect her children. For Alexander Selkirk, the vegetation of the island was his silent congregation. The trees, the ferns, and the hidden roots were the elemental truths that stood between him and the yawning void of starvation. Tonight, let us breathe in the scent of that island. Imagine a fragrance that is both sharp and sweet, a mixture of crushed pepper, damp earth, and the salt spray of the Pacific. This was the atmosphere of Selkirk's life. To the real Robinson Crusoe, every leaf was a word, and every fruit was a promise. He moved through a botanical Olympus, where the titans were the giant ferns, and the nymphs were the delicate orchids that clung to the volcanic rock. The guardian of the light, the pimento tree at the center of Selkirk's world, stood the Myrtus luma, the pimento tree. In the Golden Age of Piracy, wood was the primary currency of survival, But pimento wood was something more. It was a sacred fire. The tree itself is a wonder of the South Seas, with bark as smooth as polished bone, and leaves that shimmer like ether, the pure upper air of the gods. When Selkirk first stepped into the groves of pimento, he found a cathedral of scent. This would become his Hyperion, his lord of light. Unlike the damp, spitting oak of the north, pimento wood burns with a steady, silver flame. It leaves no smoke to sting the eyes or blacken the lungs. As Selkirk sat in his hut during the long Pacific wintertimes, when the sky was clothed in a shadow so thick even chaos recoiled, the pimento fire was his only sun. It provided a warmth that seemed to penetrate the very marrow of his bones. But the pimento offered more than just warmth. Its berries, small and dark, were a thea, a shining mother of flavor. In a world of salted beef and hard biscuit, the peppery, aromatic kick of the pimento berry was a reminder of the spice trade that drove the world's empires. It was the taste of the Orient in the mouth of a Scotsman. He would crush the berries between stones, using the dust to season the meat of the wild goats, turning a desperate meal into a ritual of civilization. The tree was his provider, his lamp, and his companion in the dark, the nourishing sea of green, the cabbage tree. If the pimento was his fire, the Wania australis, or the cabbage tree, was his tethys, the nourishing force. This palm-like tree, unique to these volcanic slopes, was the island's version of a miracle. At the very heart of the tree, protected by layers of tough, fibrous leaves, lay the cabbage, a crisp white vegetable that tasted of nuts and rain. To harvest it, Selkirk had to act with the necessity and nature of the first marriage of the cosmos. It was a labor of patience. He would climb the steep ravines, his bare feet gripping the basalt, to find the youngest trees. The cabbage was a vital defense against the scurvy, that dreadful Tartarus of the blood that claimed the lives of so many sailors in the Golden Age, while the crews of the Duke and the Duchess would later arrive with their teeth falling out and their skin bruised by the lack of greens. Selkirk was radiant as Phoebe. He ate the cabbage raw, hearing the crunch of the island's own vitality in his teeth. He saw the tree not as a resource to be exploited, but as a Rhea, a mother of gods, who offered her own body so that he might live. He never took more than he needed. He lived in a state of themis, or divine law, understanding that to destroy the forest was to destroy himself. The cabbage tree was his manna in the wilderness, a secret gift from Gaia to her solitary son. The cloak of the abyss, the giant ferns. As we move into the deeper, shadowed valleys, we encounter the Dixonia berteroon, the giant tree ferns. These are the cyclopes of the plant world, ancient, singular, and towering. Their trunks are draped in a shadow so thick that the sun rarely touches the forest floor. For Selkirk, these ferns were his sanctuary and his shroud. The fronds of these ferns are massive, arching over the landscape like the domed sky of Uranus. When the tropical rains descended, those sudden, violent torrents that felt like the weeping of the earth, Selkirk would find shelter beneath these green umbrellas. The sound of the rain hitting the tough, waxy leaves was a rhythmic drumming, a minima sign that lulled him into the deep, dreamless sleep of the earth. He used the dried fronds to thatch his huts, weaving them together with the precision of a man who had once been a constellation bearer of his own destiny. The ferns provided a thermal layer, keeping the Erebus of the night chill at bay. In the presence of these ancient plants, Selkirk felt the weight of time. The ferns had been there since the beginning, before sword or plow, and they watched his small human life with the indifference of the hills. They taught him the value of standing still, of reaching for the light while keeping his roots deep in the dark. The fragrant memory, wild herbs, and watercress. Finally, let us look at the smallest of his titans, the wild watercress and the Sicilium that grew in the hidden springs. These were the melior of the water, the nymphs of the clear, cold streams. In the Golden Age, water was often a source of death, stagnant, foul, and filled with the chaos of disease. But on Juan Fernandez, the water was ether, the pure breath of the gods. Selkirk would follow the streams to their source, finding carpets of emerald watercress growing in the spray of the waterfalls. It was sharp, clean, and full of the binding agent of creation, the minerals of the volcanic soil. He would gather it in his goatskin cap, eating it beside the water, listening to the pontus of the distant sea. He also found wild turnips and parsnips, survivors of Spanish gardens long since reclaimed by the wild. These were his ancestors of men, the remnants of a human history that the island had swallowed and transformed. They were hard and woody, but they tasted of the earth's own resilience. By eating them, Selkirk was participating in a union of necessity, merging his own Scottish blood with the very soil of the Pacific. The garden of sleep, as you drift now toward the horizon of your own dreams. Imagine yourself lying upon a bed of dried fern fronds. The scent of the pimento fire is drifting through the air, a fragrant smoke that cleanses the mind of its disorder and confusion. The island is quiet now, the titans of the forest standing watch over your rest. The flora of Juan Fernandez is a nourishing sea of green that carries you away from the noise of the world. There is no war here, no gold, no modern tongues. There is only the slow growth of the tree, the ripening of the berry, and the deep green peace of the wild. Alexander Selkirk is at rest in his hut, and the great mother Gaia is holding you both in her unshakable embrace. Feel the softness of the moss, the scent of the wood, and the cooling of the air. The island has provided everything. The work of the day is done. Sleep now, surrounded by the emerald guardians of the Pacific, in a garden that knows no end. In the oldest age of the world, before the gods took the form of men, the earth was ruled by creatures of vast strength and strange, wordless wisdom. For Alexander Selkirk, isolated in the yawning void of Juan Fernandez, the human world had vanished, leaving him in a kingdom of animals. These were not the beasts of a London market or a Scottish farm. They were the monstrous children of the Pacific, the elemental truths given flesh and fur. In the style of the ancient myths, Selkirk's life became a series of unions and conflicts with these beings, each representing a facet of his own survival and his own psyche. Tonight, let us listen to the sounds of this animal kingdom. Close your eyes and imagine the auditory landscape of the island. It is not a silent place, but a place of non-human language, the roaring of the titans on the shore, the bleating of the satyrs on the heights, and the soft, domestic purring of the nymphs in the huts. Selkirk was the only listener, the minimicine, who held the memory of these voices in the center of the ocean. The roaring guardians, the sea lions, on the beaches of Cumberland Bay. The Pontus gave birth to its most formidable offspring, the southern sea lions and elephant seals. To Selkirk, these were the hecatonsures, the hundred-handed ones of the surf. During the breeding season, thousands of them occupied the shore, their massive, blubbery bodies forming a wall of muscle and bone between the man and the sea. They were the guardians of the threshold, and their roar was a chaos that could be heard miles inland. Initially, Selkirk viewed them with the revulsion and wonder that Uranus felt for his monstrous children. They were grotesque in their strength, their skin scarred by battles for dominance, their eyes dark and knowing. They made the beach a place of danger, forcing Selkirk into the interior. But as time passed, he began to understand their rhythm. He saw that they, too, were bound by the divine law of the seasons. He eventually learned to move among them, a small, fur-clad spirit darting between the huddling masses. He found that even these terrible beings provided for him. Their oil became his ether, the fuel for his lamps during the winter nights when the Erebus of the dark threatened to swallow his spirit. He did not kill them for sport, but out of necessity and nature, taking only what was required to keep his light burning. They were the roaring backdrop of his life, a constant reminder that the world was vast, loud, and indifferent to the solitude of a single man. The satyrs of the heights, the wild goats, if the sea lions ruled the Pontus, the wild goats were the masters of the vast and star-strewn heights. These were the descendants of animals left by Spanish navigators, the ancestors of men in a strange biological sense. To Selkirk, the goats were his titans. They were the reason for his strength and the cause of his labor. At first, he hunted them with his musket, the lightning of the smiths. But as his powder dwindled, the hunt became an eros, a binding agent between the man and the beast. He had to become like them. He stripped off his boots and let his feet become vast and unshaking like the earth itself. He learned to run up the near vertical cliffs of the island's spine, leaping across chasms with the desire of a predator. He did not just hunt the goats, he began to know them. He recognized the different herds, the cunning of the old rams, and the radiance of the young kids. In his loneliness, he would catch the young ones and slit their ears, marking them as his own. A Themis of property in a world without courts. He would sometimes dance with them, singing his psalms to a congregation of four-legged listeners. They were his Rhea, the mother force that gave him meat, milk, and the very clothes on his back. By wearing their skins, he was literally wrapping himself in the life of the island, becoming a cyclops of the heights, a man-beast who knew no fear. The nymphs of the hearth, the wild cats, but even a king of the goats needs a minima sign, a memory of domestic peace. This came from the wild cats. Like the goats, they were castaways, the offspring of ship S. Mausers, who had found the island to be a paradise of disorder and confusion. As we have seen, the island was plagued by rats, the shadows of the old world that gnawed at Selkirk in his sleep. To combat this chaos, Selkirk recruited the cats. He wooed them with scraps of goat meat and fish, speaking to them in the soft, rhythmic tones he had forgotten how to use with humans. Slowly, they returned to him. They became his Melior, the nymphs of his hearth. Imagine Selkirk's hut at night. The pimento fire is burning low, casting a shining light on the walls of goatskin. And there, in the shadows, are hundreds of eyes. The cats lived with him in such numbers that they covered his bed and his floors. Their purring was a nourishing sea of sound that drowned out the terrifying roars of the sea lions on the beach. They were his only touch, his only physical connection to the warmth of another living thing. In their presence, the quarrelsome and unruly nature of the Scotsman finally found rest. He was the Lord of Light in a kingdom of fur, a man who had replaced the society of men with the society of the silent, the winged messengers, the birds of Juan Fernandez. Finally, let us look at the pure upper air and the birds that inhabited it. The island was home to the fire-crowned hummingbird, a tiny, iridescent iris that darted among the cabbage trees. To Selkirk, these birds were the Aphrodite of the island, beautiful, fleeting, and untouched by the violence of the world. He watched the hawks, the Hyperions of the sky, soaring over the ridges, looking for the same prey he sought. He felt a kinship with them. They were all solitary hunters, all observers of the yawning void. There were also the petrels and the albatrosses, the messengers of the deep, who spent most of their lives at sea and only came to the island to rest. They were the only creatures who knew the secrets of the horizon, the only ones who could bridge the gap between his island and the world of the Titans beyond. Selkirk saw in the birds a reflection of his own soul. He was a creature of the earth, bound to the rock and the goat. But his mind was like the albatross, always soaring, always looking for the white sail that would break the line of the sky. The birds were his Phoebe, the radiant ones who reminded him that there was a world above the clouds, a world of light and movement that did not require the labor of the hands, the peace of the beast. As you sink into the abyss beneath the earth, the deep, restorative sleep of the night, imagine yourself surrounded by Selkirk's animals. Feel the weight of the cats on your legs. Hear the distant, rhythmic roar of the sea lions and the soft, scratching sound of a goat on a nearby ridge. In this kingdom, there is no justice or law, only the union of necessity. The animals do not judge Selkirk's past. They do not care for his gold. They see him as he is, an elemental truth of the island. He has found a place in the cycle of night and day that is not dictated by science, but by the heartbeat of the wild. The real Robinson Crusoe is at peace because his monstrous children have become his family. The chaos of the island has been tamed by the force of love and desire, the simple, primal bond between the man who provides and the beast that stays. Sleep now in the company of the silent, where the only language is the breath and the only law is the dawn. Time, in the world of the city, is a linear march of progress and decay. But in the yawning void of Juan Fernandez, time was a circle. It was a cycle of night and day, of rising tides and falling leaves, governed not by the clocks of London, but by the elemental truths of the cosmos. For Alexander Selkirk, the passage of the seasons was the slow breathing of the island itself, rhythmic expansion and contraction that reshaped his soul. To understand the real Robinson Crusoe, one must understand how he moved through the star-strewn Uranus of the Pacific calendar, becoming a man of the seasons rather than a man of the years. Tonight, let us feel the shift in the air. Imagine the island as it moves through the great year. There are no months here, only the transition from the radiant Phoebe of the summer to the shadow so thick of the winter. Selkirk was the only witness to this transformation. The Minimacine, who recorded the changing light upon the basalt cliffs. He learned that the island was never the same twice. It was a Rhea, a mother of gods, who changed her garments with the passing of the hours. The radiance of the high summer in the summer months, which in the southern hemisphere begin when the north is cloaked in Snotha Island, was a place of ether, the pure upper air. The sun, the lord of light, Hyperion, stood directly over the emerald peaks, turning the Pacific into a sheet of beaten silver. During this time, the chaos of the winter storms retreated, leaving a stillness so profound that Selkirk could hear the fire-crowned hummingbird's wings from across the valley. This was the season of Eros, of desire and abundance. The wild plums and cabbage trees were heavy with fruit. and the nourishing sea of the forest floor was alive with the scent of crushed mint and pimento. Selkirk spent these days in a state of constant presence. He did not need the fire for warmth, only for the ritual of the meal. He would spend his evenings on his lookout, watching the star-strewn heavens descend. He saw the Southern Crosta constellation bearer of the deep south hanging like a jewel over the water. In the summer, the yawning void felt less like a grave and more like a playground. He ran with the goats in the long twilight, his body tanned the color of the earth, his spirit light as the wind. He felt the union of earth and sky in every breath. He was the king of the island, a man who had conquered the disorder and confusion of his early months and had entered the golden age of his own making. But the island is a patient mother, and she knows that after the light there must always come the nix, the night, the descent of the autumn mists. As the year turned, the shining mother of the sun began to dip lower toward the horizon. The air grew heavy with the vapors of the underworld. This was the season of the mists, when the shadow so thick even chaos recoiled would roll in from the Pacific, swallowing the shore and the peaks in a single gray breath. For Selkirk, the autumn was a time of minimicine, of memory and reflection. When the mists enclosed his huts, the world became small, limited to the reach of his firelight. The horizon, his only window to the world of men, was boarded up by the clouds. He was forced inward. In the mythology of his mind, the mists were the Furies, bringing with them the faces of the past. He would sit by his pimento fire, listening to the drip of the condensation from the fern trees, and he would remember. He remembered the gray stones of Lower Largo. He remembered the smell of the cobbler's shop. He remembered the quarrelsome words he had spoken to his father. The island was using the silence of the autumn to hollow him out, to remove the last vestiges of his modern tongue, so that something older could take its place. He learned to love the mist. He saw it not as a shroud, but as a binding agent that held him close to the heart of the island. He was no longer looking for a ship. He was looking for himself in the gray mirror of the clouds. The wrath of the winter storms. Then came the winter, the Tartarus of the island's cycle. In the South Pacific, winter is not a time of ice, but a time of wind and brontice, the thunder. The Pontus of the sea would rise up in a frenzy, the waves battering the cliffs with a force that shook the very foundations of the world. The hecatontures of the surf, the sea lions, would huddle closer together, their roars lost in the screaming of the gales. This was the season of necessity. Selkirk's survival was no longer a dance, it was a battle. He stayed within his huts, the walls of goatskin straining against the wind. The Erebus of the dark lasted for 14 hours a day. He burned his pimento wood day and night, the radiant flame his only defense against the cold damp. During these storms, the real Robinson Crusoe understood the true power of the Titan suns. He saw the trees uprooted by the wind and the cliffs scarred by the rain. He felt the fragility of his own life, a tiny, invisible Titan holding a spark in the middle of a celestial war. He prayed with a fervency he had never known in the Kirk. His prayers were not for gold or rescue, but for Themis, for the order of the world to hold, for the sun to return, for the island to remain beneath his feet. The winter stripped away his pride, leaving only the unyielding flint of his will. The rebirth of the spring, but Gaia, the earth herself, did not lie idle. Even in the heart of the winter, the stirrings of existence were beginning. With the first lengthening of the days, the island began its rebirth. This was the season of Aphrodite, the goddess of life, rising from the foam. The waterfalls, fed by the winter rains, surged with a will of their own, carving new paths through the fern-choked ravines. The melior, the nymphs of the wild, brought forth new shoots of watercress and young cabbage trees. The goats brought forth their kids, the radiant young ones who leaped with the joy of the newly made world. Selkirk felt the blood of the cosmos rising in his own veins. He would emerge from his winter hut, his skin pale from the dark, and he would stand in the first warm sun like a man being born for the second time. He would clean his tools, scour his pot with the fresh sand of the spring tides, and sing his psalms to the pure upper air. The cycle was complete. He had survived another year of the yawning void, and in doing so, he had become more permanent, more vast, and star-strewn himself. The timelessness of the soul. As you descend now into the abyss beneath the earth, the deep, restorative sleep of the night, feel the warmth of the summer, the chill of the mist, the power of the storm, and the hope of the spring. For Selkirk, the seasons were not just weather. They were the form and direction of his soul. He had learned that to live in the Golden Age, one must accept the night and the day in equal measure. He was at peace because he no longer fought the time. He became the time. The island is breathing with you, now a slow, seasonal breath that stretches across the centuries. Alexander Selkirk is at rest in his hut, and the great mother Gaia is turning the world toward the dawn. Sleep now in the sanctuary of the circle, where every end is a beginning, and the silence of the island is the music of the spheres. And so, we reach the end of the star-strewn path. We have followed Alexander Selkirk from the grey and cold shores of Scotland to the yawning void of the Pacific, through the thunder of the privateer wars, and finally to the nothingness of his Atlantic grave. The real Robinson Crusoe is no longer a man of flesh and unyielding flint, but a part of the memory of all things. He has become an elemental truth, a story we tell ourselves when the world feels too loud and the sky feels too heavy. Tonight, as the Erebus of sleep finally descends upon you, let us return one last time to the island. Imagine it now, sitting in the vast, nourishing sea of the Pacific. The titans of the peaks are still there, shrouded in their shadow so thick. The melior of the pimento woods still release their peppery scent into the pure upper air. The hecatonchires of the shore still roar their chaos at the rising moon. The legacy of the silence, the island of Juan Fernandez, was renamed Robinson Crusoe Island in 1966, a final union of necessity between the man and the myth. But names are just modern tongues described by men. The island itself remains older than language itself. It does not care that a Scotsman once lived there, just as it did not care when he left. It is a Gaia that remains vast and unshaking, a reminder that the world is much larger than our griefs and much deeper than our memories. What Selkirk left us was the sickle of truth. He proved that even when we are cast into the abyss beneath the earth, even when we are hidden away beneath layers of rock and grief, there is a part of the human spirit that can find its form and direction. He showed us that chaos is not a monster to be feared, but a gaping nothingness from which we can birth our own order. He was the cunning Cronus who killed his own father, the old, angry version of himself, fanned from that violence. He birthed Aphrodite, a state of beauty and serenity that lasted him the rest of his days. He was a man of the Golden Age, not because he found gold, but because he found the radiant center of his own soul. The closing of the eyes. As you drift now into the void of your own sleep, feel the binding agent of this story holding you. You are no longer in the disorder and confusion of the day. You are in the chapel of your own mind. The pimento fire is burning low, a small, shining light in the center of the dark. The cats of your thoughts are curling up around you, their purring, a nourishing sea of sound. The real Robinson Crusoe is with you in the silence. He is the spirit of the man who knows that to be alone is not to be lost. He is the navigator who has found the fixed point of the heart. The Pontus of the world is distant now, a faint, rhythmic pulse like a second heartbeat. The great Mother Gaia is holding you. The Sky Father Uranus is arching over you, star-strewn and vast. The cycle of night and day is turning, and you are part of its elemental truth. There is no more work to be done. There are no more goats to hunt, no more ships to watch for. The Golden Age is here, in the stillness, in the yawning void that has finally been filled with peace. Good night, traveler. The island is safe. The sea is calm. The real Robinson Crusoe is at rest. And so, at last, are you,